should be late due to some car issues. So he is on his way. So we'll record the first part so he doesn't miss anything. I forgot I got to put the microphone on because it doesn't amplify. So first and foremost, let me extend my heartiest of congratulations to you for surviving modalities. Good job. That was not an easy task, and you made it. I'm proud of all of you all still continuing on with us. So that's woo. Yeah, I agree. All right. Yeah, Jesus. Wow, that was loud. Yeah, so there we go. So again, congratulations for making it through modalities. Hope you learned a lot. You should have more answers now about why you see certain things clinically. Once you were observing, you may have seen people use different modalities for different reasons. Some of them you may have never seen used in a clinical setting before. I can't tell you the last time I've used wound care, like doing hover tanks and all of that. I can't remember the last time I've used one of those. So some of these you may not get to see used a lot clinically. Some you will. And this will be one that you will see a lot. E-Stim is one you shouldn't go a day without seeing it in some capacity if you're working in an outpatient setting. Inpatient setting, you may or may not see it, just depends on the patient type. So I've used it in inpatient before. If I've had a patient who post-op total knee replacement, they just can't seem to fire their quadricep muscle. If I want to try to get the quadriceps stimulated, get the femoral nerve reawakened, I'll use it for things like that. So I've used it in acute care. I've used it in outpatient a lot. I've used it in all types of settings. Everything I've worked in, I've used it. So E-Stim is something you're going to see a lot. So the first lecture we'll do is one that's not in your book. It's actually one from offline. It's called Electrotherapeutic Basics. Unfortunately, it's the intro lecture. Unfortunately, the computer is down or the internet is down. So hopefully, if you have your phones, you may be able to use your phones and connect. And again, I'll be recording the lecture, so that will help you as well. So we'll put this one online, so it's a review. Should be the first lecture up underneath the course. The course should be published. Let me make sure so that I'm not telling you a fib. I think I published the course last week. So it should be up under. Perfect. Okay. Yeah, if you all will click on that, again, my apologies that the internet is down. We never know when that's going to happen. But if you'll go to modules, and yep, the electrotherapeutics intro PowerPoint. So that's where we'll start today. I think the book is limited on some of this information. And so it led to a lot of questions early on. So what I decided to do was just turn those questions into a PowerPoint to make it make more sense. So give you some foundation before we start using all these big terms that you've never heard of and stuff you've never done, because you're going to learn electrotherapeutics in a way you probably have never learned it. So unless you're a licensed electrician, some of this stuff is going to be unfamiliar. But we're going to walk you through it, I promise you. Okay, so any questions before we begin there? Okay, all righty, so let's have a chat about it. So today we're going to deal with a little bit of the history of it. We're going to deal with introduction. We're going to talk about how we're actually using this modality. What is its job? So we can use it to do different things relating to different purposes. So we're going to talk about what those are. We're going to talk about resting membrane potential, which is the most essential component to understanding what's happening as it relates to E-Stim. So what are we doing when we're dealing with E-Stim? We have to start with resting membrane potential, and then we'll talk about action potentials. And all of that comes together to help formulate the understanding of what's happening at the actual physiological level when we're doing it. So I know most times if you've ever seen it done, you just see people walk up, they put electrodes on someone, they turn on a machine, they jack up the intensity and they walk off. Never again. You will learn to do it the right way. Not saying that's the wrong way, but you're gonna learn, hopefully, why we're doing it and why we're specific and strategic about everything we do. Okay, so let's dive in with some of the history. What's very interesting about electrotherapeutics is it dates all the way back to 400 BC. So 400 before Christ. So this is how far back E-Stim, or the use of electricity, we'll say it that way, is how far back the use of electricity has been used for the treatment of patients or people who are having issues relating to their physical health. Traces all the way back to Hippocrates, where he used torpedo fish to treat headaches. We don't do that anymore. So we're not going to be sending electrical current through your brain since it works on an electrical system. 2 shots of electrical can short out a system, stop your brain. So, but that's where it really started. Hippocrates back 400 BC using torpedo fish, or these electric eels. They call them torpedo fish, but they're really just electric eels. And so that's where it begins. That's the history of it. And it has gone forward as far as Nikola Tesla and the understanding of the creation of the small battery pack in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and then formulating electrotherapeutics from there. But that's where it originally starts. Okay, so as it relates to electricity in general, so when we're dealing with electricity, we have multiple types of electricity. When we're dealing with things are supplied with power either one or two ways primarily. It's either going to be alternating current or direct current. Direct current is going to be a continuous unidirectional flow of current that's delivered no matter what. So batteries are your best scenario for a direct current. So they're going to continue to provide their current flow for as long as the device is in use. Have you ever had batteries in your remote control and fallen asleep on your remote and you wake up the next morning and your remote is dead? If you've never done that, it's a really frustrating thing to do. I've done it before. But the reason the remote is dead, when you fall asleep on it, your body weight is pushing on the remote. And as long as there is something giving the remote stimulation, the batteries are going to constantly provide that current. So they will continually provide the current as long as something is asking it for it. So batteries are a great example of direct current. Be they batteries in your devices, be they batteries in your car, batteries are a great kind of direct current. So they're instantaneous and it's continuous. As long as you're asking the battery to supply power, it's going to supply it until it dies. Children toys are another one. I go through tons of these every year. I have a drawer full of batteries now. Same way, because my kid leaves a toy on all night, and then he comes to me in the morning, Daddy, it doesn't work, it doesn't work. Because it killed the battery. It was constantly on, so as long as it needed power, it supplied power. The other type of current that we use in society is alternating current. Alternating current types are things like wall plugs. So anything that we can plug into a wall, chargers, computers, everything that you plug in, your phones, anything that you plug into an outlet is a type of alternating current. It supplies current specifically to a device as long as it is connected. So if it disconnects from either the source or from its source, then it would no longer provide power. Have you ever lived in a house and your power is gone out? Yes, that's alternating current. You go to try to plug something in, every time my power goes out, my kids still walk around the house flipping lights like they're gonna magically work. I don't know why. Or they'll walk around plugging in their devices. They're trying to plug up their iPad. Or my little one is pointing the remote at the TV. Daddy, it doesn't work. Yeah, baby, we don't have power. So that's alternating current, things we plug in. So those are the two types of ways that we will actually get current from a device to a patient. Some devices will use direct current, so they're usually called portable devices. They use a direct type of current. And some devices are plug-in devices and they use alternating current. The book will tell us there is not substantial difference between the potency or the ability. What in the world? There's not much difference between the quality of stimulation, no matter if we're using a plug-in device or if we're using a battery-powered device. The battery-powered devices are going to be stronger, and from what most people will tell you, but the book will tell you there's not much difference. There's not substantial difference. But those are the two ways that we're going to get current to a device so that it can get current to a patient. So the thing about current, electrical current, once it, the way that it works is it's the flow of charged particles either from a device, from a battery or from a wall plug through a device and then back into the flow of the device. So current, when we plug in a battery and we are trying to use something, or we plug in our phone with AC current, what's happening is current will leave the device from the positive connector. So usually this is the positive connector, and then it travels from the connector into the circuitry of the device to power the device, and then back into the negative terminal. So current flows from positive to negative, whereas electrons, and you won't need this for right now, but we will later when we talk about iontophoresis, electron flow is actually in the opposite direction. So current, for right now, current flows from the positive pole back to the negative pole, positive pole through the device to the negative pole. That's how a circuit is completed. So if there is no circuit, there is no flow of current. Okay. So again, E-Stim machines, like we said, can either be direct current or they can be alternating current machines. They can have either one. They're usually not both, so it'll be one or the other. We'll play with both here in the class. Again, AC machines, alternating current machines, will need to be plugged into a wall at all times to function. Direct current machines work either on AA batteries or on a 9-volt. And so most of the devices we have are 9-volt specific. So different ones will do different things. As it relates to the machines themselves, the machines will use the same names of current as what we are currently familiar with. So we're familiar with terms like direct current and alternating current. So the machine will use direct and alternating currents as well to do stimulation to the patient. So we use a direct or alternating current to power on the device, and once the device is powered on, the device produces either a direct current or an alternating type current for the treatment of the patient. The different currents are going to have different names, and we'll go through those later. But they use direct and alternating currents as treatment currents for patients. So there are some currents that we will use in patient care that are direct waveforms. I should say that. So the current is what's being supplied by the device, and then what leaves the device is a waveform. So let me clear that up. So when we're powering on the device, so we're trying to get power to it. The actual E-Stim machine. We can do that either through direct current, and those are batteries, or we can use alternating current, which are wall plugs. As it relates to the machine itself, the machine or the E-Stim device uses waveforms that have the same name. So most E-Stim devices will say they have a direct current waveform. They have an alternating current waveform. And then they'll have another one that only exists in the use of electrical stimulation devices. So you only will find this third current type when you're dealing with E-Stim. It doesn't exist anywhere else in nature. And that's going to be pulsed waveforms. So when we are selecting treatment types in the machine, we're picking specific waveforms. Or some of them, as it relates to them being portable devices, will already have the waveform pre-selected. So some of them, usually on the AC devices, you will be able to choose what kind of waveform you want to use. You'll be able to select if you want an AC or an alternating current waveform, or do you want a pulsatile waveform, or do you want a direct current waveform. But usually in the portable devices, that's going to already be pre-selected for you. So it will come with a preset waveform. We don't get to choose that one. It's pre-chosen for us. So usually the portable devices, their waveforms are going to be pre-selected for us. And all of them will come with the instructional manual, so you'll be able to see what type of waveform they're using, because different waveforms produce different tissue effects. So I choose a certain waveform because I'm trying to get a specific effect in the tissue that I'm treating. So waveforms create effect. That's the main takeaway from that. Waveforms create effects. So selecting the right waveform will either make me more successful or less successful. So it's important that I know all of the different aspects of the waveform so I'll know what am I trying to accomplish. I don't want to use the same waveform to do everything, because everyone won't accomplish the same mission. Some of them have very specific missions. Make sense? So, and once we start to play with the devices, you'll go, oh, I get it. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I get that. Okay. Okay, so how does E-Stim work? How does it work? There are 3 different functions that we are trying to produce as it relates to electrical stimulation in a patient. 3 different things we're trying to produce. We are either trying to stimulate cutaneous or sensory nerves, which we'll go through those. Some of them you've already heard of. Lateral cutaneous nerve to the arm and the forearm, lateral antebrachial cutaneous, lateral brachial cutaneous. Remember those? Medial side of the arm, brachial plexus. So we're going to actually go through and relearn all those sensory nerves. So I'm either trying to stimulate cutaneous nerves or sensory nerves. Cutaneous just means nerves near the surface. So these are going to be nerves near the skin. They're near the cutaneous area. They're near the surface of the skin. So where it says cutaneous, think surface of the skin. Sensory nerve, think nerves that supply areas of the body. So I'm either trying to stimulate cutaneous or sensory nerves. Doing this is usually going to help me reduce pain. So if I'm trying to stimulate cutaneous or sensory nerves only, I am trying to usually reduce pain, trying to bring down pain. And we'll talk about how that mechanism works. I remember hearing Ms. Jonna mentioning it to y'all, and she's gone through it as well, dealing with the gate control theory of pain, Melzek and Wall. We'll dive even deeper into that theory. So I'm trying to stimulate cutaneous nerves or sensory nerves so that I can reduce pain. The second thing I'm trying to do is stimulate motor nerves. These are the named nerves that you already know: median, ulnar, radial, axillary, femoral, sciatic, tibial, common perineal. These are motor nerves. They're called motor nerves because they are the nerves responsible for supplying the action from my brain that actually goes through my spinal cord, that then goes out to my muscle and causes it to move. So motor nerves work by starting with the brain. So your brain tells your body to move. Let's say if I'm trying to flex my shoulder, that information comes originally from my brain. It's then transmitted from my brain, and we're going to go into a lot more detail than this. It goes from my brain down through my spinal cord to a motor nerve, and then to a muscle or muscles. And that's how I get motor performance. So E-Stim can hack this system. So instead of my brain being the signaling agent that tells my nerve to signal my muscle that makes me move, E-Stim can signal my nerve, and then it tells my brain and my muscle to move. So I'm hacking the system. So I'm either stimulating cutaneous and sensory nerves to usually bring down pain, or I'm stimulating motor nerves so that I can facilitate muscle contraction. And we want muscle contraction for a lot of different reasons, and we'll go into some of those. Some of those are neural reinnervation, meaning we're trying to get the brain communicating with the muscle better. We're trying to stimulate more motor units. Some can be muscle, that's called muscle re-education. We can do muscle strengthening. We may need it for that. We may need it for, to prolong muscle endurance. It's helping us with endurance. Or we may use it to release trigger points. So there are a lot of different reasons and ways we can produce muscle contraction from E-Stim. There's a lot of reasons why we do it. And we'll get into all of those, I promise you. We're going to dive into it. You'll know what each of those things I just said means. And then the last way that we can do electrical stimulation is to stimulate an actual muscle itself. So when we're stimulating motor nerves, we're not actually stimulating the muscle, we're stimulating the motor nerve. And the nerve tells the muscle what to do. There are some situations where the nerve doesn't function well. Let's say someone has a spinal cord injury, or they have a block where the nerve is no longer communicating with the muscle. And I still want to stimulate the muscle. There are ways where we can stimulate just the muscle and not the nerve, and that's called de-innervated muscle stimulation. It does not. They've done a lot of updated studies. It does not prevent atrophy. There's a lot of people who thought so for years. We thought the science behind it showed that it would. Christopher Reeves, I don't know if y'all remember Christopher Reeves. Superman from back in the day. So he was the first Superman. You look him up on your phone during the break. He was the first Superman. His name was Christopher Reeves. He's interesting to our profession because he had a horse accident where he was thrown from a horse and severed his spinal cord, had a spinal cord injury, and became tetraplegic. So he was unable to move from his neck down. So he was a tetraplegic. And being that he was well off, so he was wealthy in a sense, but he also had very deep pockets because of the people he knew. He did a great deal for spinal cord injury rehabilitation. He probably was one of the single largest donors to that cause of anybody in U.S. history. And so early on, they were thinking, hey, we can continue to use E-Stim to help decrease muscle atrophy. So if we do E-Stim, we'll be able to maintain muscle size. So atrophy just deals with size. So the normal size of the muscle. So you have a muscle that has its normal size, normal. When the muscle gets bigger, i.e. you're lifting weights, you're going to the gym, you're lifting weights, so your muscles then hypertrophy, they get bigger. Or if you're no longer performing activities, the muscles will atrophy, they will shrink. So they thought that E-Stim was a way to help prevent it, but they actually have shown through consistent studies that it's not. What it does is it does allow for the muscle to at least have functional mobility, so that you don't get joint stiffness, so that the joint actually will have functional mobility for positioning. So, but doesn't prevent atrophy. Good question. So therapeutically, we don't do a lot of stimulating de-innervated muscles. There are things on the market that actually do it, and we'll show you some of those that actually help with de-innervated muscle stimulation. Hopefully we'll get back online here. Maybe we're back. Let's see. Nope, okay. So once we get back, we'll show you some of those. There are some great devices out now that help with this, that you can actually, they're great for deep perineal nerve, tibialis anterior stimulation. It's not deep perineal nerve anymore, but tibialis anterior muscle stimulation, trying to help dorsiflexion to help someone walk more efficiently. So these are de-innervated muscle stimulators, and they're built-in devices. So I'll show you those. But as it relates to E-Stim, the three things that E-Stim is normally used for: one, stimulating cutaneous or sensory nerves. That's usually pain modulation. Two, stimulating a motor nerve, the named nerves that we've talked about, the motor nerves. We'll stimulate those, and that's to help facilitate a muscle contraction. Or E-Stim can be used to stimulate de-innervated muscles, where there is no connection between the nerve that's supposed to supply the muscle and the muscle itself. Something has severed or is interfering with the connection. So it doesn't always have to be severed or cut. You can have a disc herniation that's really large and it's pressing on a nerve, and it can start to lower the innervation to the muscle. Okay, so that's what we're dealing with when we're trying to do E-Stim. So how does the first two happen? Because remember, the third one, the first two deal with actually stimulating a nerve. This one is stimulating a nerve. This one is stimulating a nerve. This one actually stimulates the actual muscle. So how does it work when we're trying to stimulate nerve fibers, nerve cells? So the yellow things that are running down the body here. How does this work? How do we stimulate nerves? Okay. As it relates to the body itself, the body actually communicates via electrical currents already. Your brain runs on an electrical current. Your heart runs on an electrical current. One of the big ones is your heart. Your nerves communicate through electrical current. So the way this works is your nerves have what we call a resting state, where they are not being stimulated at all. So when you're not contracting your muscle actively, your muscle is in a resting state, and your nerves connected to the muscles are in a resting state as well. So if I'm not actively using the muscle is in a resting state. If I'm not stretching it or using it, it's resting. When it is resting, you can actually measure what's going on inside of a resting nerve, or even a nerve that is contracting, or a nerve that's being stimulated. I don't want to say nerves don't contract. Nerves are stimulated and they force muscles to contract. So resting nerves can be measured on the inside of the nerve to determine what's going on inside of it. When the nerve is at rest, it is in a state of what we call resting membrane potential. The way we know the nerve is resting is because we measure the electrical activity going on inside of the nerve. So they can stick a probe in your nerve and measure the actual electrical activity of what's going on inside of your nerve. They can probe it and determine it. A resting nerve has a resting membrane potential electrical current of minus 70 millivolts. So we have nerves, and they're going to stimulate. The goal of a nerve is to stimulate either sensory or motor responses. Shoot. So a nerve's job is to stimulate sensory or motor responses. If they are not being used for that, then the nerve is found at rest. If it's not being stimulated, it will have what we can measure to see if a nerve is at rest or if a nerve is being stimulated for no reason. We can have overactive nerves. Anybody ever hear of restless leg syndrome? Hear that on the TV all the time? I have restless leg syndrome. What that is they measured the resting potential of the nerve and found out that the nerve is being overly stimulated for no reason. So the nerve is firing even though you're not telling it to fire. So nerves should have rest period where we're not asking them to fire. And a nerve at rest can be measured. As not just at rest, a nerve at rest or a nerve that is being stimulated Okay? So a nerve can be measured. That's weird. We'll get more tape. So a nerve can be measured. A resting nerve, the measurement of a resting nerve has an electrical current of minus 70 millivolts. So the current or the voltage output, meaning we're able to stick a probe in it and see what the nerve is actually putting out, what it's actually doing. So the current of a resting nerve equals minus 70 millivolts. And that minus 70 millivolts is what we define as resting membrane potential, meaning the nerve is not being stimulated at all. The nerve is fully at rest. Stick a probe in the nerve, it's minus 70 millivolts. It's not being stimulated. This minus 70 millivolts is, or this resting membrane potential is maintained by two elements that exist either inside of the nerve or outside of the nerve. It's maintained by sodium and potassium. So it's maintained by sodium and potassium. Okay. Okay. So there's going to be more potassium on the inside of the nerve cell, which is going to help to keep the inside of the nerve cell negative as it relates to its charge or its voltage, and then the outside is going to be maintained by sodium. And it creates a gradient. So there are gradients that help to keep the two separated as it relates to the nerve cell. That's what keeps the resting membrane potential functional. Is there's a gradient or like a fence or a barrier that keeps the sodium on the outside of the cell and keeps the potassium on the inside of the cell, so that the nerve can remain at rest. So it's constantly being maintained. There are channels built into the gate or like a fence. So think of it like a fence. So we have a picket fence. Let's draw that. So we will have a picket fence here. Let's draw a fence. Fence. These are our fence posts here. I am not an artist. So we have a fence. So this is our fence. Imagine you're standing in front of a house. You see a fence. So there's a fence that keeps sodium outside and potassium inside. So potassium is here and sodium is here. Sodium is like your knuckleheaded friend that your parents don't want you to hang out with. No, stay outside the gate. No, we don't trust you. Nobody but me. Okay, good stuff. All right, so sodium is outside, potassium is in. There are, however, gates. So this would be a gate or a gate, yeah. So we'll call this our gate here, and all throughout the fence along the nerve cell where sodium is allowed to enter and potassium is allowed to be pushed out. So the nerve is allowed to be maintained at rest as long as we keep enough sodium out and enough potassium in. So we're able to maintain resting membrane potential by keeping sodium out here and keeping potassium in here, relating to our nerve cell. So sodium is outside of the cell, potassium is inside of the cell. And that's maintaining resting membrane potential. Or is helping to keep our nerve cell in a resting state. Okay? Does that make sense? So resting membrane potential is a measurement of the electrical activity of what is going on inside of a nerve. So it's letting you know that the nerve is not being stimulated. The nerve is at rest. Resting membrane potential's current measurement or voltage measurement is minus 70 millivolts. So we can actually stick a probe in it and measure it, minus 70. And that is maintained by having two elements in balance. We're having sodium balance inside of the cell and potassium outside of the cell. Okay? So, what happens when I want to force my muscles to now move? Because my nerves can't stay at rest all of their lives, or I would just do nothing. I would just be a blob, just laying there, blob. But I need to actually force my muscles to move. I need to get up, I need to get dressed, I need to eat, I need to function. So I need my nerves to communicate with my muscles to tell them to move. So when I want my nerves to talk to my muscles and tell them to move, the way that that is done is by not just neural connection from the brain. So the brain talks to the spinal cord, and then the spinal cord sends a message to the nerve, and it does it in the form of an action potential. So when I want to move a certain muscle or muscles, I need to do something functional. Say you're eating or combing your hair or getting dressed in the morning. Whatever you're doing where your muscles are moving, the reason your muscles are firing is because your brain communicates the signal that you need to perform an action. That information is transmitted down to your spinal cord to the level that the muscle is located, and then that information is transmitted from your spinal cord to an actual nerve, and the way that that information is done is through an action potential. So an action potential occurs when a stimulus, either from your brain or it can be from an E-Stim machine. Remember, an E-Stim machine can function just like the brain. It can tell nerves to function. So when a stimulus comes from some source, so it's either coming from my brain or the E-Stim machine, and it causes the cell membrane, or it causes the nerve cell, it causes the peripheral nerve that we're dealing with to now become more permeable to sodium on the inside of the cell. So an action potential hits, so it's electrical, it's an electrical stimulation, either coming from the brain or it's an electrical signal that either comes from the brain or an E-Stim machine, and then it triggers information to the peripheral nerve to tell the peripheral nerve, hey, we need to now start the process to fire the nerve to do whatever action we're trying to do. So if I am trying to lift my arm up to reach something in the cabinet, my brain sends the signal, it sends, it communicates through an electrical signal from my brain to my spinal cord and then into my peripheral nerve that innervates my anterior deltoid and my scapular muscles that support it. And it tells it, okay, we need to contract to lift the arm to grab something. And the way that our muscle gets the signal is through that action potential. And the action potential's job at a cellular level is to cause for the cell to now start taking in more sodium, which was outside of the cell, and bringing it inside of the cell. When sodium rushes into the nerve cell, it leads to an action called depolarization. It's a big word, depolarization. So depolarization simply means I am changing the polarity inside of the nerve. I'm changing the polarity inside of the nerve cell or inside of a nerve. Depolarization, changing the polarity. So what does that mean? I'm glad you asked. Again, inside of the nerve cell, it's going to be more negative. So inside of the nerve cell, remember, it's minus 70 millivolts. So on the inside of a resting nerve, it's going to be negative. Outside of a resting nerve, the polarity is going to be positive on a resting nerve. So on a resting nerve, the inside of the nerve cell has a negative polarity, which we measure at minus 70. The outside of the nerve cell has a polarity that is positive. When an action potential occurs, what it's leading to is depolarization, or we are now changing the polarity of a nerve cell. We're going to start rushing all of this positive sodium into the nerve, and we're going to change the polarity from negative to positive. So the way the information is transmitted from my spinal cord to my muscle is through action potentials happening and it's depolarizing the nerve. So it's leading from the spinal cord all the way out to the muscle along that nerve, and it's causing depolarization. We're changing the polarity on the inside of a nerve cell from negative to positive. So with an action potential, we are going to start to flood the inside of the nerve with sodium and start to push out some of the potassium that's in there. Okay. All right. So that's what we're doing to get to depolarization. But we have to reach a certain level so that we can actually depolarize the nerve cell. So take about 5 minutes, stretch your brains. We'll come back and talk about what we need to do to make sure we get a full triggering with our action potential. Okay, so again, the way nerves communicate is through electrical energy. So nerves receive information from the brain that is then funneled through the spinal cord. So the brain, spinal cord, then from the spinal cord out to a nerve cell. So that's information going from the brain to the spinal cord, and it uses electrical energy. Okay? If a nerve is not being stimulated, the nerve is at rest. It's relaxed, it's doing nothing. A resting nerve can be measured internally to see what type of electrical current continually flows through it. Because there's always movement of ions no matter what, which means it's always going to give off a charge, even if it's at rest. So there's always a charge no matter what. So the charge that we're able to measure a nerve cell at is minus 70 millivolts. So at minus 70 millivolts, or resting membrane, or its resting membrane potential. Let me erase it. So if a nerve cell is at minus 70 millivolts, or if it's at rest, so I have my nerve cell, it's at minus 70 millivolts. What that means is that in the nerve cell, so this will be our nerve here, this will be outside, this will be inside. So outside of my nerve cell, I have more, or let me do it this way. Okay, so outside of my nerve cell, I have a lot of sodium. Lot of sodium. Sodium everywhere. But inside of my nerve cell, I have a lot of potassium. And that's helping to maintain resting membrane potential. This setup helps me maintain resting membrane potential. I have a lot of sodium outside of the cell, which means outside is going to be positive. It has a positive polarity, meaning just like a battery, the top part of the battery, those are poles. So when you look at a battery, The up portion here, that's the positive pole. The flat part is the negative pole. And that just talks about their polarity. So outside of a nerve cell, the polarity is positive. Inside of the nerve cell, my polarity is negative at rest. Okay? So outside of my nerve cell, positive. Inside of my nerve cell, negative, which gives me a reading of negative 70 millivolts when I'm measuring it. Make sense? Okay. But I don't need my nerves to be at rest all the time forever. It means I'm just a blob, I'm just laying there. So now I need my muscle to move. I need my nerves to begin to communicate with my muscle and tell it to move to do something, whatever I'm asking it to do. You're now using your hands to write. So the way you're getting your hand wrapped around the pencil to write, to grip, your nerves are telling your hand muscles to grip the pencil and to move. So the way that information is communicated, that I need to now use my muscles for something, is I have to have an action potential happen. And so an action potential is simply an electrical current to a nerve cell or to a nerve to tell them to function. So a simple way of thinking about an action potential is electrical current or electrical energy that tells the nerve that it needs to now function. So the action potential is what gives the nerve the information that it's time to communicate with the neuromuscular junction so that now my muscle can move or fire. The action potential's job, what it's doing as it's releasing this electrical energy, it's causing something to happen at the nerve cell level. It causes sodium to begin to rush into the cell. So now let's say with this, I now have an action potential that happens here. Tells my brain is telling my body that it needs to move. And so an action potential happens in that area, and I start flooding the inside of the cell with sodium. And as I'm flooding the inside of the cell with sodium, I'm kicking out the potassium. It's got to go. We're taking over. Sodium is taking over. Potassium is being kicked out. So to know that this is happening, just like I can measure resting membrane potential at a minus 70 millivolts, I can measure action potential electrical energy, proving that it's happening. And when an action potential occurs, it's going to start to change the polarity of the inside of the nerve cell. So the inside of the nerve cell begins to go from a negative, it goes from a negative polarity to a positive polarity. So when the action potential fires, this messenger that tells my nerve it's time for it to function, it starts to change the internal makeup of the nerve cell, making it positive versus making it negative. And that's what the video was showing you. Let's see if I can get back to just showing you the curve. Okay, yeah, so this is a good picture. So at rest, my membrane potential is minus 70. When the action potential occurs, it's going to raise my membrane potential from negative 70, and it will raise it all the way up to a positive 30. The reason it's going from negative 70 to positive 30 is because I am now kicking majority of the potassium that was inside of the cell out and flooding the inside of the cell with sodium. So as I'm flooding the inside of the cell with sodium due to my action potential, I am changing my resting membrane potential. So my resting membrane potential, let's see, minus 70, 0, plus 30, well, let's see, plus 50. So at rest, I'm just hanging here minus 70. Now I get an action potential that hits, and I start to kick sodium into the cell and potassium out of the cell. It starts to raise the level of my membrane potential, or it starts to raise the voltage that I'm able to measure inside of the cell from a negative to a positive. So this is happening because sodium is coming into the cell, and potassium is leaving the cell. Both are positives, so opposites don't attract. Well, no, opposites attract, likes repel. So they're both positive substances, and so the potassium, the sodium rushing in, even though it's positive, it repels away the sodium and helps to push it out of the cell. So the action potential's job is it starts to let the nerve cell know that it's time to function, and it does it by opening these sodium potassium pumps that push sodium into the cell and pushes potassium out of the cell, which is going to make it more positive. We can measure that. It usually will get all the way up to a positive 30. So when an action potential fully functions, it raises the membrane potential that we measured at a minus 70 all the way up to a plus 30. Once it gets to plus 30, it then triggers that sodium potassium pump that it's time to close and now start to bring our membrane potential back to its normal state. So the plus 30 signals to our sodium potassium pump inside of the nerve cell that it is now time to reverse the situation. It's time to start pumping sodium out of the cell again and pumping potassium back in. So that's the goal. If we want to communicate, if we want our nerve cell to communicate the information of what we're trying to do appropriately, we need an action potential to occur to let the nerve cell know what it needs to do. That process is called, again, depolarization, where we're changing the polarity inside and outside of the nerve cell. So the action potential produces depolarization. Let me write that. And again, depolarization is just simply changing the polarity of the nerve cell. It's changing the polarity from negative to positive. So it goes from a negative 70 to a positive 30. That's depolarization. We literally change the polarity from a negative 70 all the way up to a positive 30. Okay. For an action potential to cause depolarization, the signal has to be strong enough to actually cause it to depolarize. The magic number of what's needed for full depolarization is the stimulus has to depolarize from a minus 70 up to a minus 55. So minus 55 serves as the threshold level for an action potential to actually do the job of depolarization. So the stimulus has to be strong enough to depolarize from minus 70 up to minus 55. Once it gets to minus 55, all the doors are open and everything depolarizes. Sodium rushes in, potassium is kicked out. If it does not reach a place where it gets to a minus 55, then we call that a sub-threshold stimulus. It didn't reach the threshold needed to actually cause an action potential. That would be, when you think about that, think about sub-threshold. Have you ever had a really small bug crawling on your leg and you not notice it? You're sitting outside, it's a little small bug, it could be a ladybug, it's crawling on your leg. Oh shoot, sorry about that. A ladybug is crawling on your leg and you not notice it until you look down and you go, that's a darn ladybug on my leg. Sub-threshold stimulus. It's crawling on you, but it's not leaving enough pressure where the stimulus is depolarizing the sensory nerve to tell you something is crawling on you. Versus something bigger, if you ever had a heavier, but an ant or something else that really has more of a body weight than this crawling on your spider. You ever have a spider crawling on you and you feel the legs and you look, dadgummit. So that's a threshold stimulus. So if it's not going to reach threshold, then it's not going to cause full depolarization. We call that subthreshold stimulus. But anything that depolarizes to threshold that actually causes an action potential to occur to lead to depolarization, we call that threshold. Some things can be super threshold. Let's say you put your hand on a hot stove. It's going to let you know immediately. That's kind of a super threshold stimulus. But it still produces the same action potential as a threshold stimulus. So just because it has more intensity does not mean it's going to produce more of an action potential. Okay? So the threshold potential that is needed for an action potential to fully depolarize the nerve cell is minus 55 millivolts. So at rest is minus 70. Things can happen where we're not receiving the information. Those are sub-threshold. And then something happens that gives us threshold stimulation. And then something can happen that gives us super threshold stimulation. But threshold and super threshold still produce the same action potential. Okay? So sub-threshold, again, no action potential. Threshold and super threshold, you're going to get the same result, depolarization of the nerve cell. The reason for that is action potentials are all or none. You don't get a partial, no partial credit. Either it's going to meet threshold and cause depolarization, or it's not. Okay? All righty. So again, once depolarization goes from that minus 55 threshold level to a positive 30, that triggers the cell to now enter what we call repolarization. So once it gets to positive 30 triggers repolarization. So positive 30 triggers repolarization, which reverses the process of what was going on during depolarization, which means now we're going to start kicking all of that sodium outside of the cell again and bringing all the potassium back. When we do this, there's going to be an overshoot of how much sodium we are kicking out of the cell and how much potassium we're bringing back in, and that leads us to a state of hyperpolarization, where we have so much potassium inside and so little sodium that it goes beyond the normal resting membrane potential. So it'll go beyond minus 70. Okay. So this is a good slide. Let's explain it to you. So this is a reading of a nerve cell. It's at resting membrane potential here, minus 70. Then we have a couple of failed initiations, some small things that happen, small bug crawling on your leg. Your sheets glance your leg while you're laying in the bed, but it still doesn't cause you to move your leg. Something small happens, the air conditioning blowing on it. It doesn't change your mentality about it. So these are failed initiations here, the little small blue lines. This is something that actually causes a full depolarization from an action potential, leading us from minus 70 to minus 55, all the way up to plus 30. That's depolarization. Whatever that stimulus was caused full depolarization, or it caused the pushing out of the potassium that's normally in the cell and the bringing in of the sodium, which was normally on the outside of the cell. We depolarize until we reach a point of positive 30, which triggers repolarization, or the now bringing back the potassium and kicking out the sodium. We do that with such great efficacy that we go beyond the normal resting membrane state to a positive 80, to a negative 80 or negative 90 here, and that's called hyperpolarization. This time right in here. All of this area here is hyperpolarization until we come back to its resting state or resting membrane potential of minus 70. Okay. So the action potential is what triggers the nerve that it's time to function. The nerve triggers the muscle and causes it to function. Action potential triggers the nerve, nerve triggers the muscle. Okay? So again, physiology, with depolarization, sodium is rushing in, Na, sodium is rushing in, whereas potassium, which is K, is rushing out. There are two periods that occur as we are returning for repolarization. We have a period of absolute refractory and a period of relative refractory. Absolute refractory runs about 2 milliseconds, 0.02 milliseconds. And it says that during absolute refractory period, another action potential can't come along and cause that nerve to be depolarized again. It's going to have to wait till it gets back to a state where it can be stimulated so that it can then function again. That's absolute refractory period. The time when an action potential, no other action potential, no matter how strong it is, can cause depolarization during that period of time. So about 2 milliseconds, up to about 2 milliseconds. Whereas relative refractory period says if a significantly stronger stimulus comes and stimulates the same area, it's going to then produce another action potential. So absolute, another action potential, no matter how strong, it can't cause for the nerve to depolarize again, for that 0.4 to 2 milliseconds. Then after that, a stronger stimulus than the original one can come and cause the nerve cell to depolarize again. And that relative refractory period is about 10 milliseconds. Okay. We'll cover this part once we start playing with the actual machines. Okay? So that's nerve physiology. Okay? Take about another 5 minutes, stretch your brains. We'll come back.